My sisters and brothers, the first reading that we hear today from the Book of Wisdom is one you've probably heard at funerals. If you remember the reading, the souls of the just are in the hands of God, and no torment shall touch them. It's the same book. This is just a little bit farther on. This comes from chapter 15. The reading most of us know comes from chapter 3. The Book of Wisdom is one of the books that would eventually arrive into the Catholic canon, but not the Protestant canon. Hermanos y hermanas, la primera lectura que nosotros escuchamos hoy es una lectura nosotros sabemos particularmente de los escitas cristianos. Cuando nosotros escuchamos, las almas de los justos son en las manos de Dios. Es la misma parte, es el mismo libro, ese es un capítulo 15, la parte que nosotros escuchamos más frecuente durante los funerales es el capítulo 3. Y el libro de sabiduría es uno de los libros que nosotros incluimos como católicos en la Biblia que los protestantes no aceptan. Y el libro de sabiduría, el punto es cómo vivir en una sociedad cual no es judaico. Esto es porque era una gran comunidad de los judeos en cual es hoy Egipto en los tiempos durante el séculos antes de Cristo. Y ese libro escribiendo más o menos 150 años antes del nacimiento de Cristo. The Book of Wisdom has as its focus, how do you live your life as a religious person, as a Jewish person, outside of the land of Israel? When the Book of Wisdom was written, about 150 years before the birth of Jesus, there was a large Jewish community in what is modern-day Egypt, in a city called Alexandria. And the people there that spoke Greek, not Hebrew. And so while they may have said prayers in Hebrew at the synagogue, the language they would have spoken day to day was Greek. And as people were asking, how do we live out our faith in this context where we have no temple, which of course is over in Jerusalem, there is no large Jewish community, there's a small community in the midst of a much wider pagan community. How do we put our faith into practice? What does it mean to be living in this way? And the writer of the Book of Wisdom would seek to answer that. Now, there was something else going on that would become later very important for biblical reasons in Alexandria at the time as well. And that is that the Old Testament was translated into Greek. And ultimately 7 other books that were written in Greek would be accepted into the Catholic Bible. Durante este mismo tiempo era una otra cosa importante. La gente que hablaba greco también trasladó los libros de los hebreos a hebreo a greco. Este es, digamos, el Septuagint text. Este es en el libro cuando se dice LXX, es indicaba el texto Septuagint. MS es Masoretic text, es el original en hebreo. Se digamos Septuagint porque es una referencia a la gente que traslaba a hebreo greco. Y tradicionalmente se diga los rabinos, la gente que trabaja cada persona en un cuaderno separada y todos hacen la translación sin la ayuda de Google y sin la otra referencia y toda la gente hace el mismo translación, digamos, es un milagro. Entonces nosotros usamos esta palabra Septuagint por lo honor de esas personas. Now, the Book of Wisdom shows up in what is called the Septuagint text. And if you look in a study Bible and you see LXX, the Latin numerals for 70, that's what they're talking about, the word Septuagint coming from the Greek for 70. And that is the Greek text, the translation from Hebrew to Greek. If you look in a study Bible and you see MS, that's the Masoretic text, the original Hebrew text. Now, the way the Septuagint got its name, and the reason it's called the Septuagint is because when the people were speaking Greek and not Hebrew, they decided to translate the Bible from Hebrew into Greek. And the tradition says that 70 scholars, each by themselves in their own little cubbyhole, did an entire translation without consulting one another or without the help of Google. And by some miracle, they all had exactly the same translations. The rabbis said it is a miracle and divinely inspired, and so we refer to it as the Septuagint text in honor of the 70 translators. Now, most of the time, it will not make a lot of difference to you whether you're looking at the Greek text or the Hebrew text. It makes a difference, of course, for those 7 books that were written in Greek, and they would ultimately not be accepted by the Jewish rabbis when the final split between what is now modern-day Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity would happen about the year 100. They accepted only those books which had been written in Hebrew. But there are a couple times when it does make a difference. Hermanos y hermanas, normalmente la diferencia del texto masorético y el texto Septuagint no es muy importante. Pero en casos sí son importantes. Una es porque nosotros aceptamos los 7 libros que escriban en greco y los hebreos no aceptan porque no escriben en hebreo. Otro tiempo porque una cosa dogmática cuando una clarificación existe en greco que no existe en el texto masorético. Por ejemplo, en la profecía de Isaías, nosotros escuchamos un nacimiento milagro. Nosotros como cristianos pensamos esta profecía en la luz de Cristo. One of those places where it makes a difference is Isaiah's prophecy, Isaiah chapter 6, when we hear about a forthcoming miraculous birth that we as Christians also believe refers to the person of Jesus. So Jesus was born of who? Who is Jesus' mother? And she was she a virgin or was she an unmarried woman? Well, both. We would say both, right? Un ejemplo es en Isaías capítulo 6, se dice una persona hace un niño. ¿Cuál es la palabra nosotros digamos para la Virgen María? Nosotros digamos específicamente virgen, non chiquita. En hebreo, diga chiquita. No se diga virgen. Esto en el texto greco. If you look in the Hebrew text, it says the young girl. So could she be married? Sure. Could she be engaged? Sure. We don't know. In the Greek text, it says specifically virgin, and that's one of the times where you see where it does make a difference. So there are places where the translations do make a difference, and of course, as we all know, part of the teaching around Jesus of Nazareth is that he is born of the Virgin Mary. When we look towards the gospel and we start understanding why these texts are important, it's important to ask ourselves, why was this particular first reading chosen to go with this gospel? And I would suggest to you it's the latter part of the gospel that we're being called to pay attention to, because it calls us to look at something we don't usually like to look at, and that's God's justice. God is both infinitely merciful, but God is also just. Hermanos y hermanas, cuando nosotros pensamos, porque es la primera lectura, por esto el Evangelio es importante que nosotros realizamos, las dos cosas importantes en Dios. Dios es misericordio, pero también Dios es justo. No es una diferencia en las dos cosas, porque en Dios esas cosas arriban perfectamente. Entonces nosotros escuchamos, en el primer libro se diga el autor, la noche de la liberación pascual fue anunciada con anterioridad a nuestros padres para que se confortan el reconocer la firmeza de las promesas que en hablan credo. Y él continúa diga, por eso los piadosos hijos de un pueblo justo celebraron la Pascua en sus casas. De ese común acuerdo se impusieron esta ley sagrada. De todos los santos participan por igual de los bienes de los peligros. Y entonces cantaron los himnos de nuestros padres. We hear in the first reading, the author says, on the night of the Passover that liberated us, it was announced beforehand to our fathers, and they took comfort in remembering the firm promises that God had made to them. That, of course, is a reference to the event in Exodus that we all know so well, right? The angel of death comes in, and what happens? Strikes down the Egyptians. The firstborn of the Egyptian, from Pharaoh to Pharaoh's servant, was struck down. But not the homes of the Hebrews, because they had been told to do what? Put blood on the doorposts and over the lintel. Now, common sense tells you nobody does that unless they're expecting something to happen. I mean, honestly, when was the last time you put blood on your doorposts? I'm guessing you haven't. So they knew and they believed in the promise that God had said. They were expecting God's action, and that goes, we continue to hear that when we hear the children of the just and the people were celebrating the Passover in their homes, following in obedience the sacred law, that the holy ones would participate equally in the goods and in the dangers. And in this they sang hymns. They sang the hymns of our fathers. They were expecting God to act and for God to fulfill his part of the covenant that he had promised to bring the people to liberation. And of course, if you go back and you read the book of Exodus, you read all about the leaving of Egypt. Es importante, hermanos y hermanas, que en la primera lectura, en la noche de la liberación, nosotros escuchamos la referencia a la Pascua de los hebreos. Y nosotros recordamos las acciones de Dios que prende a la gente afuera de la esclavitud a la realidad de liberación. Y nosotros escuchamos la idea de los hebreos, tiene la confianza que Dios acta con su palabra. Dios acta con justicia por su pueblo. And so when we think about God's justice, one of the things we have to ask ourselves is, when we say God is just, on whom is God acting? Because what we really want is God to go just on somebody else, right? We don't really want God's justice for ourselves. We want God to go just on them. And so we should ask the question, was God just to the Egyptians? It's a lot less comforting, isn't it? And that probably depends on whether or not you're an Egyptian. How you answer, was God just, depends on which side of that particular divide you were on. Were you one of the Hebrews or were you one of the Egyptians? Nosotros escuchamos la justicia de Dios en la palabra de Jesús cuando diga a los apóstoles y dice, fíjense en esto, si un padre de la familia supliera, Cuando nosotros escuchamos la respuesta del Señor, supongan que un administrador puesto por su amo al frente de servidumbre, con el encargo de repartirles a su tiempo alimentos, se porta con fidelidad y prudencia. Nosotros simplemente podemos pensar que nosotros somos eso de un servidor de prudencia y de fidelidad. Nosotros simplemente no pensamos que nosotros somos el servidor se diga, mi amo tardía en llegar y empieza a maltratar a los criados y las criadas y comer y beber, a embriagarse en el día pensado y a la hora más inesperada llegará su amo y castigará severamente. Nosotros no pensamos que nosotros somos los servidores no responsables. When we hear of that parable of the servant, one who is about his master's work and in fact is doing what he is told to do, that's typically the one we like to picture ourselves as, right? We don't like to so much identify with the servant who is beating the men servants and the women servants, eating, drinking, and being drunk. You ever notice we never identify with that servant? Because ain't none of us sinners, right? Ain't none of us not about what we're supposed to be about, right? And so how we hear this parable and how we hear about God's justice depends who do we identify with in that parable. Do we identify with the faithful steward or the unfaithful steward? Do we identify with the master or the servants who are being beaten? Depending which one we identify with, we will hear this parable very differently. Depending how we see ourselves on what has been entrusted to us will change how we hear this parable. My sisters and brothers, we have been entrusted with our faith. We have been entrusted with the power of the sacramental life of the church to sustain us and to strengthen us. We've been entrusted with the catechism and the teaching of the church to help us proclaim what it is that we believe and to share it with others. We have been entrusted with all that God has given us. And I have good news for you. We know when the end of time is. If you pull out your missalette and you look at the Feast of Christ the King, that's when it'll be. The Feast of Christ the King is the symbolic end of time. So you have now until 5 weeks in front of Christmas to make sure you're ready for the end of time. Check it off the list, one less date to worry about. Hermanos y hermanas, depende que en cuál persona nosotros tenemos la residencia, quien nosotros pensamos es nosotros, el servidor fidel, el servidor infidel, los servidores o el maestro. Nosotros cambiamos cómo nosotros escuchamos esta parábola. Y depende en nosotros, depende cuál es nuestra respuesta a esta parábola. Nosotros podemos pensar y reflectar cuál es nuestra obligación, porque se diga el Señor, a la persona que recibe mucho, necesita hacer mucho también. Nosotros recibimos el enseñamiento de la Iglesia, nosotros recibimos el poder de los sacramentos, nosotros recibimos el catequismo y el enseñamiento de la Iglesia para ayudarnos a proclamar el Evangelio de Jesucristo y vivir con su palabra. Mas nuestras acciones son nuestras responsabilidades también. Porque nosotros sabemos cuándo es el fin del mundo, es la fiesta de Cristo Rey. Nosotros podemos conocer esto porque nosotros celebramos el fin del tiempo cada año en la fiesta de Cristo Rey. Es el punto de la fiesta, el fin del tiempo. Y eventualmente todos nosotros debemos responder a Dios por nuestras acciones y por nuestras acciones durante nuestra vida. Es verdad que Dios es misericordioso, pero también es justo. Es nuestra responsabilidad de vivir con nuestra fe y ayuda la proclamación de la Iglesia con nuestra fe. Porque el fin del tiempo arriba nuestro Maestro Jesucristo por dar a todos nosotros nuestro premio. My sisters and brothers, we will all one day be asked, what did we do with our life and how did we live? For at the end of time, indeed, Christ will come. And we will be given reward for what we have done. Because God is merciful, but God is also just to us. We have everything we need and much has been entrusted to us. And so it's our responsibility to use what God has entrusted to us to help one another, to proclaim the good news, and to share with others the faith we have received.